Chief Learning Strategist at AMP Creative. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about perspective taking in virtual reality. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and I hope that you get really excited about it as well. So just to quickly cover what we're going to talk about today, what is perspective taking? Let's get that straight so we're all on the same page with that. Let's understand what gets in the way of perspective taking, and also understand how it's particularly enabled through VR. Perspective taking in VR is something I've got a few samples to share with you so that you can explore it yourself. We'll talk about best practices and then hopefully have time for some Q&A. So full transparency, this is pre-recorded, but I am here. So if you chat, if you have questions, I'm here. I will answer those questions. I hope that I'm here, and hopefully that can make this a little bit more interactive. All right. Perspective taking, something that I've been talking about a lot over the last couple of years. And right now, at this time in our country, if there was ever a time where we learned how to engage in perspective taking with one another, now those skills are needed more than ever. So I am really humbled to be talking about this today because I feel 100% positive that learning how to engage in perspective taking could transform the way that we talk to one another. And VR helps us to do that. So what do I mean by perspective taking? Well, perspective taking is the active contemplation of another's psychological experiences. This is something, it's a skill, an ability that the whole human family has access to. You might know some people who have a really high EQ, emotional intelligence, someone who they find it really easy to imagine what someone else might be experiencing and to connect with that other person through that capability. Others of us might really struggle with that. It might not even occur to us most of the time to engage in perspective taking. And then there are some of us on that spectrum of neurodiversity who actually struggle with basic perspective taking skills. We can all still learn how to do it, but there are some of us who must more intentionally learn perspective taking. So this is a superpower that all of us can learn and get better at, no matter how deliberate we have to be about it or no matter how easy it might come to us. So perspective taking is a superpower. What do I mean by that? Well, I will share a time where I really needed to engage in perspective taking. And it was with this little guy. This is my dog, Firkin. He knows how cute he is. And there are times in the past where he would get into all sorts of trouble when I would leave him. And I had to change the way that I thought about my space. There was a day where I came home and the space was destroyed, and no matter what I had done, he foiled me again, sort of thing. So I got down on his level and I really took a look at that space through his eyes, and I imagined what it must be like to be alone for a long time and what he must have to go through. And I ended up designing some solutions that have made both of our lives a lot better. So I engaged in the act of perspective taking, and I'm sure that we can all think of a time where we engaged in that perspective taking, whether it was to understand the point of view of a partner, a child, someone with whom we work, a neighbor. And think about a time that you did that successfully. And try to imagine to yourself, what were the components about that experience that allowed you to engage in perspective taking. So just consider that for a moment. And then think about during that really successful time where you used perspective taking, what rose up out of it? So when you did connect with someone else's experience that was different from your own, what did that feel like? And what feeling really motivated you to change your behavior or try a different tack? So most people talk about how perspective taking is the precursor to empathy, right? So empathy is that ability to recognize, understand, and share another's feelings. So perspective taking comes first, and then from that is that shared experience of empathy. Perspective taking is kind of magical. So I'll talk a little bit in just a bit about how I became so fascinated with perspective taking. But first, I just want to tell you about the literature, peer-reviewed studies that have been done to really understand how perspective taking might change the outcomes of situations. So perspective taking is shown to have pro-social effects. So pro-social effects means basically whenever you have a group of people or two people who engage in perspective taking, outcomes are more favorable once they engage in perspective taking. So you might say, well, okay, so what are some of these studies? What does perspective taking improve? Well, I have a template here that has 6 spots in it. So I chose 6 ways that perspective taking increases positive outcomes, but I could have chosen 30 or 40. It's just incredible the impact that perspective taking has on favorable outcomes with human interaction. So perspective taking counteracts expressions of bias. I just want to let that sit there for a while. So these are the studies that I read were in reference to gender bias and racial bias. And so expressions, outward expressions of bias are reduced when the participants engage in considering what someone else's perspective must be like. It decreases implicit bias. So the outcomes of implicit bias when people are not aware that they harbor biases is counteracted through perspective taking. It also increases team creativity. So you get a diverse group of people together and ask them to consider one another's unique perspectives. Innovation increases, creativity increases. So that's another excellent outcome. It stabilizes marriages, folks. So any sort of relationship that two people engage in, if they consider where the other person is coming from, they consider their perspective, that relationship is going to improve. And it also reduces the time that it takes to resolve conflicts. So it increases conflict resolutions, and last of all, creates successful leaders. So bias is reduced, creativity is increased, relationships are strengthened, conflicts are resolved, leaders are formed when they engage in perspective taking. Let's all do it, right? Let's engage in perspective taking right now. Well, there are some things that get in our way, okay? There are some blockers that keep us from understanding someone else's worldview. And those blockers can be categorized in 2 basic categories. So one is motivation and the other is ability. So why would I want to? Okay, that's a hard one to get over. That's a hard blocker to get past. When someone is simply saying, yeah, not for me, thanks. Not today. I don't believe maybe that it's going to have such a dramatic effect on my outlook, or I don't have time, or whatever that might be. So motivation is a huge one. Ability is another. It is difficult for us to move from this center of experience that we are all feeling, that we're all anchored to move from here outside of our sort of egocentric viewpoint. We kind of aim and kind of throw where we think something's going to land, but we fall short of our target time and time again. So I have a plan. I have an experience that I've had and that my company has had and that our clients have had, and that is that one can get past these blockers of motivation and ability and enable perspective taking through VR. And we do that in two ways. The first thing we do is we motivate through the experience of perspective taking in virtual reality. So we give people that experience. It is frictionless. They do not need to have skill in order to engage in it. We create, through immersive video, a perspective taking experience that takes away all of the things that have gotten in their way before. They don't have to have motivation because we haven't put it on. There it is. They don't have to have skill because we've created a cinematic experience that's beautifully researched to reflect the lived experience of others who are different from the participant. And then they go through this, they take off the headset. There is a very delicate transformative moment because of the intensive perspective taking that they've engaged in. And during that very critical time where they are motivated to learn how to do this without the headset on, we teach perspective taking skills. So it's this double whammy. We motivate through VR, and then we teach perspective taking skills by modeling it after that experience that they've had. So you have the ability to experience some perspective taking experiences that have been created for virtual reality. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. And each one of these really counteracts a major blocker in perspective taking when we try to engage in it on our own. So us who have few skills in perspective taking, who don't understand a perspective taking framework, can put on this headset and they can engage in a frictionless perspective taking exercise that really overcomes these blockers. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the major blockers. For each one that I talk about, there is a perspective taking experience that I'll share. So the first blocker number 1 in engaging in perspective taking, is the fundamental attribution error. That's when we blame others when bad things happen to them, but blame external situations when bad things happen to us. So if something bad happens to your neighbor loses her job, let's say, you might think, yeah, well, I've seen how sloppy she is with her trash, so I'm not surprised. She obviously did something wrong, and that's why she lost her job. However, when we lose our job, we understand all of the external situations that prevented us from doing our best. And we don't extend that grace and understanding to others. That is the fundamental attribution error. And this was the exact blocker that engaging in perspective taking, this next experience that I'm going to talk about, really challenged the fundamental attribution error. And that's becoming homeless. Perhaps you have heard about this or experienced it. This experience was created by the Virtual Human Interaction Lab at Stanford. It's really counteracting that fundamental attribution error. It's a misconception that losing one's home and becoming homeless is due to who you are and the choices that you make. And becoming homeless, a human experience, that's the title, really seeks to counteract this irrational tendency to attribute the fundamental attribution error to people who are homeless. This immersive virtual reality experience from Stanford's Virtual Human Interaction Lab allows you to spend days in the life of someone who can no longer afford a home. You're going to interact with your environment. You're going to attempt to save your home and protect yourself, but all of your efforts are for naught. And in the end, you go from being evicted to living in your car to finally spending time on the bus. It's really fascinating the way that they use gameplay elements that you lose again and again and again, and more is taken from you. It's a very impactful experience, and it really forces you not to turn away from acceptance that fundamental attribution error is a perspective-taking blocker. So I encourage you to seek this out and experience it for yourself. So the next thing that blocks us from engaging in perspective taking is something called naive realism. So that is when we think that we see the world as it truly is, we expect other rational beings to see the world similarly. Our worldview, we think, is the correct one. And when others align with us, we think they're rational. However, if you encounter someone who doesn't share our perspective, we assume that they might be too lazy to properly process information. We might think they're biased or they're subject to different, inferior information. So the perspective-taking experience that I think really counteracts this is one called notes on blindness. So some people who are sighted might have a perception that those without sight have a diminished experience of the world. And Notes on Blindness really turns this on its head. It's about being blind. In this case, it's a collection of audio recordings from John Hull. They've been merged into this amazing VR application. John Hull was a writer and theologian. He died in 1983 after steadily deteriorating. His eyesight deteriorated until he became blind. But he recorded these amazing audio recordings that really shared his perspective, and they've been turned into this incredibly rich experience that has been created out of the research of what it feels like to experience the world when blind. And the goal was to give the user as few visual elements as possible and to really get them to focus on the audio and to force their brains to sort of reconstruct scenes the way people without sight do. So I highly encourage you to experience it. It's a really beautiful, evocative experience. And then one of the last blockers to us engaging in perspective taking is something I think we feel very familiar with when we talk about bias, and that's intergroup bias. Okay, that's a really broad umbrella term that encompasses all preferences towards members of one's own in-group and prejudice against out-group members, whether that is a implicit or explicit bias, whether one's aware that one is doing that or unaware. This is all kind of categorized under intergroup bias. And there is an experience called VR for Inclusion. It's presented by Facebook. I had the honor of working on this really incredible experience, and I highly, highly recommend that you engage with it. You can download it at vrforinclusion.fb.com. You can experience it there. I think download might not be the right term. And it's got some materials that go with it, some learning materials, so that you might use it at your workplace. And in this, we really seek to counteract that in-group bias by engaging in perspective taking, the perspective of 5 women who have experiences that are represented of women around the world who work in male-dominated workplaces. So I would love for you to check those out and see what I mean about how perspective taking in VR can be a very motivational experience and can really motivate one to seek out those perspective taking skills. So it's a springboard to teaching people perspective taking frameworks. And that, unfortunately, is something that I don't have time to get into. It's something that I am incredibly passionate about, and it's work that I've been doing for the last couple of years and will extend into the future of creating experiences where people engage with perspective taking in VR, who take off the headset, and then who learn how they can do that on their own without a professionally produced VR experience. And I want to tap into, I just want to kind of fly through some best practices really quickly, and then have a little bit of time for some Q&A, I guess, through chat. I have experienced some best practices around 360 and 180 video, specifically when one is creating a perspective taking experience. We've created one called Perspectives on Bias. And so I've got some best practices that I'll just go through really quickly, because I think that they allow us to create perspective taking experiences for that represent people who have very different lived experiences from our own. Because we as creators need to give voice to those who might not have access to this technology. So that's really the first one. Collaborate with those who live the experience. So for Perspectives on Bias, which is something that AMP Creative designed and produced and has been demoing. You might have gone through one of our demos at one of our booths. I worked with a team who helped to create this very rich, authentic piece of VR media. And the material for Perspectives on Bias was informed by primary sources, by interviews, and through research, so through secondary resources. The second sort of best practice that I'm really passionate about is that we need to cue the user. So a lot of people who when I'm using perspective taking experiences in VR, I'm working with people who are not gamers. So I need to cue them about what they are going to go through. Because for some of them, this is the very first time they've put on a headset. And we do that by introducing them to the person that they are going to be engaging with. And then we set up a scene where they get to see them in that scene. And then we literally explicitly invite them to take on that person's perspective. So cueing for perspective taking can be really important to allow the learner to go through, kind of breadcrumb them through what they need to get there. I won't say comfortably, because it can be a challenging experience, but so there's less sort of cognitive jarring and visual jarring. We create engagement through motion and through blocking a scene so that the learner moves their head. So again, we're talking about, and I say learner because these are learning experiences that I'm creating, but we don't have a lot of challenging motion in our experience. And this is, so far, we're working a lot with just a 3DOF experience. So we block the scene so that our learner is following the action and having engagement that way, but we don't have them moving and having a lot of jarring motion. We have tested that and learned that that's not best for these. So it's really passive scenarios that we're looking for. We're looking for scenarios where it makes sense, the creative of the scenario makes sense for our perspective to be one that is stationary, and where most of the time where our the point of view is from a seated position where our learners are also seated. And then really create a sense of presence. So create presence by having other people speak directly to your point of view, asking that point of view questions, really making this an interactive scene. So not something they're passively just watching, but something that they are a part of. Others react with expressions and body language to the words of the POV. So I encourage you to go through our demo of Perspectives on Bias, or to watch VR for Inclusion, which really uses a lot of these techniques. And now I would love to save just a few minutes for Q&A for anyone who might be here and have questions for me to answer. I want to thank you for listening to me, and I'll be here, like I said, to answer questions. So thank you.